We know him as the little tramp, the silent genius, the maestro of slapstick, the man who made a fractured world laugh. But behind the bowler hat and the waddling walk, Charles Chaplin was a titan of industry, a man who built a kingdom on the currency of joy. By the year 1928 he was a god, untouchable, yet inside his gilded cage a secret was festering, a vulnerability no one could ever suspect. His life was a meticulously crafted fiction. He had escaped the squalor of his London childhood, the poverty and the constant gnawing fear of the orphanage. He had shed the skin of Charlie, the hungry urchin, and donned the persona of Charlie, the world's most beloved performer. But the past is never truly buried. It lingers in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness to re-emerge. His empire, built on silence, was crumbling. The talkies were coming, and the world was moving on without him. For a man who had mastered a language without words, this new era was a death sentence. The stress, the pressure, the fear of irrelevance. It manifested not just in his mind, but in his body. A fever, a nameless illness, began to consume him. It was a fever so intense, it was said to be the first illness that Chaplin would not control. It was burning away the man, leaving behind something else, something raw. He was a man accustomed to shaping reality, but this was a force of nature, a raging inferno that stripped him of his defenses. In the opulence of his Beverly Hills mansion, Chaplin lay broken. The doctor's pronouncements were grim, but amidst the fear and the hushed whispers of his servants, there was one who watched with a quiet understanding. Her name was Lottie, a young, barely there housemaid, a refugee from the London slums of his youth. Socially invisible, a shadow in his grand home, Lottie possessed a wisdom born of true hardship, a stillness that could cut through the most frantic chaos. She had seen this kind of fever before, in the squalid tenements of her past. She knew it wasn't just a sickness of the body, but of the soul. Chaplin, lost in a delirious haze, muttered and raved, his famous face contorted with pain. He cried out in a Cockney accent long forgotten, speaking of a mother's madness and a father's empty promises. Lottie, alone in the room, moved with a quiet purpose. She placed a cold compress on his forehead, a gentle, almost reverent touch, and that's when it happened. In his feverish state, Chaplin began to move. Not the slapstick, choreographed movements of the tramp, but something else, entirely a grotesque, beautiful dance of a man in torment, a contortion of his body that mirrored the twisting of his soul. His limbs twisted and jerked, not in comedy but in agony. It was the dance of a man trying to outrun his demons, a physical manifestation of his deepest, darkest fears. He moved in a silent, agonizing ballet, a performance no one, not his adoring public, not his closest friends, was meant to see. Lottie watched, transfixed, as the genius of comedy writhed in an inferno of his own making. The fever was not just an illness, it was a stage where the greatest comedian in the world was performing his deepest tragedy. He was no longer the master of his art. He was a vessel for a raw, unedited truth. What if the ultimate performance isn't for an audience, but for a single unseen witness? And what if the very thing you fear, your greatest weakness, is actually the key to your most profound creation? Subscribe and turn on notifications to uncover the full story of Chaplin's secret. You won't believe what happened next. When the fever finally broke, Chaplin awoke to a world still spinning, but his was completely changed. The man who sat up in bed was not the confident, commanding director. He was raw, his skin pale, his eyes still holding the ghost of the delirium. He found Lottie tidying the room, her movements quiet and efficient. Chaplin, unaccustomed to such intimacy with his staff, felt a profound, unnerving embarrassment. He had been a spectacle. He had lost control. His fury, born of his own humiliation, erupted. "What did you see? What did I do?" "I saw a man fighting. Not just the fever, sir, something else, the past, the fear. I saw the dance of a man who has carried a great burden for too long. He raged. He demanded details. He wanted to know exactly what grotesque movements he had made, what senseless words he had uttered. His logic, the sharp intellect that had engineered cinematic masterpieces, sought to compartmentalize and contain the madness. He wanted to dismiss it as a mere hallucination, a side effect of the illness. Lottie, however, was not intimidated by his fame or his anger. She met his gaze with a calm, unshakable humanity. She didn't see the icon. She saw the man. "Your body. It told a story, sir, of sorrow you've kept locked away, of a fear you won't speak. It was beautiful. Not the beauty of a film, but the beauty of a truth. Beautiful." The word struck Chaplin like a blow. How could something so shameful, so undignified, be beautiful? Lottie's simple response, her profound lack of judgment, chipped away at his carefully constructed facade. He was presented with a dilemma. He could cling to his safe, controlled world, a world where he was a master of his domain, or he could risk everything by confronting the raw, unscripted reality of what she had witnessed. The world needed the tramp, the perfect, joyful clown. It didn't need the broken dancing man he had become in his fever dream. But Lottie's words had planted a seed, a silent truth, a wisdom he hadn't found in all his fame and fortune, was now staring him in the face. She represented a different kind of strength, one he hadn't known existed. She was the antithesis of everything he had built his career on, quiet, unseen, and profoundly real. He, a man whose life was a series of meticulously crafted fictions, was now faced with the most painful truth of all, the pain he had been hiding, the trauma of his impoverished childhood, the fear of the talkies, the deep-seated loneliness. It was all there, in that dance. His choice was simple, yet impossible. Remain safe, or risk the pain of total self-revelation for the promise of a cure he didn't even know he needed. This is where the story truly begins. The battle for his soul, not his fame. The best is yet to come. The days that followed were a silent testament to Chaplin's internal war. He was no longer working, no longer directing. He would simply sit, lost in thought, the memory of his fever-induced dance haunting his every waking moment. He tried to write, to direct, but the words and movements felt empty, hollow. The genius was there, but the soul was missing. He found himself drawn to Lottie's quiet presence. He would observe her from afar, fascinated by the silent dignity with which she performed her menial tasks. She was a living embodiment of the grace he sought to capture on film, a purity untouched by the trappings of fame and fortune. Finally, one afternoon he broke. He found her in the garden, tending to a small patch of forget-me-nots. "Lottie, show me what you saw." He didn't have to elaborate. She understood. With a mix of hesitation and quiet resolve, she began to move, not in imitation, but in a recreation of the feelings she had witnessed. She moved with a silent, graceful pain, her body mimicking the contortions of his fever dream. It was a performance in itself, a dance of empathy and sorrow. For the first time, Chaplin saw his own pain reflected back at him, not as a source of shame, but as a universal human experience. It was a devastating, beautiful scene. Lottie's humble body became a mirror reflecting his deepest agony, but also his immense capacity for feeling. The emotional intensity was a hurricane. Chaplin began to cry, not the sobs of a broken man, but the quiet, cleansing tears of a soul finally unburdened. The fear of the talkies, the pain of his childhood, the pressure of his fame, it all poured out in that moment. The revelation wasn't just about his inner turmoil. It was about the profound connection between all human beings, the shared language of suffering that transcends words and fame. He realized that the power he had sought his entire life, the control he so desperately craved, was an illusion. The real power lay not in the command of an audience, but in the intimate, terrifying vulnerability of true human connection. The man who had built his career on making people laugh at his pain now had to face his own, not as an act, but as a reality. In the final months of 1928, something shifted. The man who emerged from his convalescence was not the same. He was not healed of all his anxieties, but he was at peace. The film he would go on to make, a masterwork born of this transformation, was City Lights. It was a testament to the power of silent film, to the beauty of the unspoken, to the fundamental kindness of humanity. But beneath the surface of its comedic brilliance and timeless romance was a new depth. The tramp was no longer just a clown. He was a silent, noble heart, capable of profound sacrifice. And in the final, iconic scene, when the blind girl sees him clearly for the first time, Chaplin's face, once the mask of a comic genius, was now a window to a soul that had been through a fire. He was no longer performing. He was simply being. He had finally embraced the silent, vulnerable man Lottie had seen in his fever dream. The fever hadn't killed him. It had stripped him bare, revealing a depth of character that would define his most celebrated work. His greatest performance wasn't for the world. It was a private ballet of pain and redemption, witnessed only by a woman who saw not the icon, but the human being. And in that vulnerability, he found his true, enduring art. What part of Charlie's story touched you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold Hollywood secrets.